Chapter 2 of the draft guidance, which starts on page 26, goes over Subpart C, Personnel Qualifications and Training. Section 1, on page 26 and 27, talks about how to evaluate personnel's assigned duties to identify those that are subject to the qualifications and training requirements. All personnel who handle covered produce or food contact surfaces or engage in the supervision thereof must receive adequate training and have a combination of education, training, and experience necessary to perform their assigned duties in a manner that ensures compliance with the produce safety rule. It's important to note that the definition of personnel isn't limited to farm employees. It can mean family members that help out now and again, or a mechanic who comes in for a day. An example that's given on page 27 is that shipping and receiving could involve contact with covered produce or food contact surfaces depending on the procedures. Even if personnel handle covered produce or food contact surfaces very infrequently, they are still subject to the rule requirements. Section 2 is about ensuring personnel have the appropriate combination of education, training, and experience necessary to perform their assigned duties. Some may need additional training or education depending on their past experience. An example given on page 28 is that one worker may have a good understanding of horticultural practices from a decade of experience on farms, but they may not have a solid level of food safety knowledge. If their new duties involve several activities that can largely impact food safety, they may need additional training, such as targeted training on cleaning and sanitizing practices. Section 3 on page 29 talks about training frequency. The produce safety rule requires that personnel receive training upon hiring, periodically thereafter at least once annually, and is necessary and appropriate in light of observations indicating they are not meeting food safety standards. An important thing to highlight in this section is that training must occur before personnel begin duties that involve handling covered produce or food contact surfaces, regardless of when they are hired. That being said, you may choose to delay a worker's initial training if they don't begin these duties right away. For example, if you hire workers in December to perform clerical work throughout the year and to harvest covered produce from May to October, you could choose to delay their initial training until late April. Page 30 of the draft guidance mentions that the training you deliver should have the most up-to-date information from credible sources, and you should consider a refresher training when new information becomes available, or if your procedures change. Section 4 on page 30 and 31 explains how to provide easily understandable training sessions. You should provide the training in a language that your workers typically speak, and the terminology should be tailored to their educational level. Training sessions can be in-depth and formal, or shorter and targeted towards a specific topic. Providing hands-on practice or demonstrations near their work area can be beneficial as well. Section 5, which starts on page 31, covers the minimum training requirements. On page 32, it states that the produce safety rule does not specify who can provide training. You could choose to have a qualified farm personnel or a third party conduct your training activities. The 3 topics that must be covered in the training are the principles of food hygiene and food safety, the importance of health and personal hygiene, and the standards in Subpart C through O of the produce safety rule. For the principles of food hygiene and food safety, your training topics should include relevant sources of foodborne pathogens, routes of contamination, preventative measures in order to minimize the potential for contamination, and corrective measures if covered produce were to become contaminated. To cover the importance of health and personal hygiene, your training must include information on recognizing the symptoms of a health condition that is reasonably likely to result in the contamination of covered produce or food contact surfaces. Personnel should also be able to recognize and respond when they encounter situations that present the potential for contamination of covered produce or food contact surfaces. Finally, the training should cover regulatory requirements in Subparts C through O that are applicable to the employee's job responsibilities. On pages 34 and 35, they give examples on job-specific training topics. Section 6 on page 35 talks about the specific training requirements for personnel who conduct harvest activities. On page 36, the draft guidance states that even if you use contracted harvest crews, You must ensure that they meet all of the training requirements and provide any additional training necessary. Persons who conduct harvest activities must be able to recognize covered produce that is likely to be contaminated, and they must recognize growing areas from which covered produce should not be harvested due to evidence of contamination from animals. They must also receive training on inspecting harvest containers and equipment to ensure they are functioning properly, clean, and adequately maintained. On page 37, the draft guidance states that giving examples of damaged or unclean harvest containers can help illustrate when cleaning or repair is needed. Section 7 on page 37 discusses food safety training for supervisors. At least one supervisor for your farm must complete food safety training equivalent to that received under standardized curriculum recognized as adequate by the FDA. The Produce Safety Alliance training is one way to meet this requirement. Section 8 on page 38 talks more about supervision. The personnel assigned to supervise can include full-time, permanent, temporary, part-time, seasonal, or contracted employees. They should be aware of their role in ensuring correction of deviation from your food safety procedures and the produce safety rule, and should be able to recognize when these deviations are occurring. You may choose to have just one supervisor or multiple supervisors. The final section in this chapter, at the bottom of page 38, talks about training records. You must document the date of training, topics covered, and people trained. An example that meets this requirement is an attendance sheet at the training that includes this information. If you employ contracted personnel, the draft guidance states here that you should request training documentation from the contracted company in order to meet this requirement. When making comments on the guidance, keep several things in mind. Reference the section of the rule you have a particular issue with. Be specific about the issue you are presenting. Avoid ranting. Offer alternatives to interpretation. Remember that the law is not changing or going away. This represents how the government interprets the law. The draft guidance covers all aspects of the produce safety rule except Section E, agricultural water. Public comment on this draft guidance is being accepted until April 22, 2019. Michigan State University Extension encourages looking into the guidance and commenting before the deadline.